The House in Goblin Wood by Carter Dickson. This story was commissioned by Gavin Critchley, so thank you to Gavin for supplying me with the wherewithal to do this story for the benefit of everybody else. In Pall Mall, that hot July afternoon 3 years before the war, an open saloon car was drawn up to the curb just opposite the Senior Conservatives Club, and in the car sat 2 conspirators. It was the drowsy post-lunch hour among the clubs, where only the sun remained brilliant. The Rag lay somnolent, the Athenaeum slept outright. But these 2 conspirators, a dark-haired young man in his early 30s, and a fair-haired girl perhaps half a dozen years younger, never moved. They stared intently at the Gothic-like front of the Senior Conservatives. "Look here, Eve," muttered the young man, and punched at the steering wheel. "Do you think this is going to work?" "I don't know," the fair-haired girl confessed. "He absolutely loathes picnics. Anyway, we've probably missed him." "Why so?" "He can't have taken as long over lunch as that," her companion protested, looking at a wristwatch. The young man was rather shocked. "It's 3:45. Even if— Bill, there, look there." Their patience was rewarded by an inspiring sight. Out of the portals of the Senior Conservatives Club, in awful majesty, marched the large, stout, barrel-shaped gentleman in a white linen suit. His corporation preceded him like the figurehead of a man of war. His shell-rimmed spectacles were pulled down on a broad nose, all being shaded by a Panama hat. At the top of the stone steps he surveyed the street, left and right, with a lordly sneer. "Sir Henry!" called the girl. "Hey?" said Sir Henry Merrivale. "I'm Eve Drayton. Don't you remember me? You knew my father." Said the great man. "We've been waiting here a terribly long time," Eve pleaded. "Couldn't you see us for just 5 minutes?" "The thing to do," she whispered to her companion, "is to keep him in a good humour. Just keep him in a good humour." As a matter of fact, H.M. was in a good humour, having just triumphed over the Home Secretary in an argument, but not even his own mother could have guessed it. Majestically, with the same lordly sneer, he began in grandeur to descend the steps of the Senior Conservatives. He did this, in fact, until his foot encountered an unnoticed object lying some 3 feet from the bottom. It was a banana skin. "Oh dear," said the girl. Now, it must be stated with regret that in the old days certain urchins of what were then called the lower orders had a habit of placing such objects on the steps in the hope that some eminent statesman would take a toss on his way to Whitehall. This was a venial but deplorable practice, probably accounting for what Mr. Gladstone said in 1882. In any case, it accounted for what Sir Henry Merrivale said now. From the pavement, where H.M. landed in a seated position, arose in H.M.'s bellowing voice such a torrent of profanity, such a flood of invective and vile obscenities, as has seldom before blasted the holy calm of Pall Mall. It brought the hall porter hurrying down the steps, and Eve Drayton flying out of the car. Heads were now appearing at the windows of the Athenaeum across the street. "Is it all right?" cried the girl, with concern in her blue eyes. "Are you hurt?" H.M. merely looked at her. His hat had fallen off, disclosing a large bald head, and he merely sat on the pavement and looked at her. "Anyway, H.M., get up. Please get up." "Yes, sir," begged the hall porter. "For heaven's sake, get up." "Get up?" bellowed H.M. in a voice audible as far as St. James's Street. "Burn it all, how can I get up?" But why not?" "My behind's out of joint," said H.M. simply. "I'm hurt awful bad. I'm probably going to have a spinal dislocation for the rest of my life." "But, sir, people are looking." H.M. explained what these people could do. He eyed Eve Drayton with a glare of indescribable malignancy over his spectacles. "I suppose, my wench, you're responsible for this." Eve regarded him in consternation. "You don't mean the banana skin?" she cried. "Oh, yes, I do," said H.M., folding his arms like a prosecuting counsel. "But we only wanted to invite you to a picnic." H.M. closed his eyes. "That's fine," he said in a hollow voice. "All the same, don't you think it'd have been a subtler kind of hint just to pour mayonnaise over my head or shove ants down the back of my neck? Oh, Lord, love a duck. I didn't mean that, I meant—" "Let me help you up, sir," interposed the calm, reassuring voice of the dark-haired and blue-chinned young man who had been with Eve in the car. "So you want to help too, hey? And who are you?" "I'm awfully sorry," said Eve. "I should have introduced you. This is my fiancé, Dr. William Sage." H.M.'s face turned purple. "I'm glad to see," he observed, "that you had the uncommon decency to bring along a doctor. I appreciate that, I do. And the car's there, I suppose, to assist with the examination when I take off my pants." The hall porter uttered a cry of horror. Bill Sage, either from jumpiness and nerves or from sheer inability to keep a straight face, laughed loudly. "I keep telling Eve a dozen times a day," he said, "that I'm not to be called doctor. I happen to be a surgeon." Here H.M. really did look alarmed. "But I don't think we need to operate, nor, in my opinion," Bill gravely addressed the hall porter, "will it be necessary to remove Sir Henry's trousers in front of the Senior Conservatives Club. Thank you very much, sir." "We had an infernal nerve to come here," the young man confessed to H.M., "but I honestly think, Sir Henry, you'd be more comfortable in the car. What about it? Let me give you a hand up." Yet even 10 minutes later, when H.M. sat glowering in the back of the car and two heads were craned round towards him, peace was not restored. "All right," said Eve. Her pretty, rather stolid face was flushed. Her mouth looked miserable. "If you won't come to the picnic, you won't, but I did believe you might do it to oblige me." "Well, now," muttered the great man uncomfortably. "And I did think, too, you'd be interested in the other person who was coming with us. But Vicky's difficult. She won't come either, if you don't." "Oh, and who's this other guest?" "Vicky Adams." H.M.'s hand, which had been lifted for an oratorical gesture, dropped to his side. "Vicky Adams, that's not the gal who—" "Yes," Eve nodded. "They say it was one of the great mysteries 20 years ago that the police failed to solve." "It was, my wench," H.M. agreed somberly. "It was. And now Vicky's grown up, and we thought if you of all people went along and spoke to her nicely, she'd tell us what really happened on that night." H.M.'s small, sharp eyes fixed disconcertingly on Eve. "I say, my wench, what's your interest in all this?" "Oh, reasons." Eve glanced quickly at Bill Sage, who was again punching moodily at the steering wheel, and checked herself. "Anyway, what difference does it make now, if you won't go with us?" H.M. assumed a martyred air. "I never said I wasn't going with you, did I?" he demanded. This was inaccurate, but no matter. "Even after you practically made a cripple of me, I never said I wasn't going." His manner grew flurried and hasty. "But I got to leave now," he added apologetically. "I got to get back to my office." "We'll drive you there, H.M." No, said the practical cripple, getting out of the car with surprising celerity. "Walking is good for my stomach, if it's not so good for my behind. I'm a forgiving man. You pick me up at my house tomorrow morning. Goodbye." And he lumbered off in the direction of the Haymarket. It needed no close observer to see that H.M. was deeply abstracted. He remained so abstracted indeed as to be nearly murdered by a taxi at the Admiralty Arch, and he was halfway down Whitehall before a familiar voice stopped him. "Afternoon, Sir Henry." Burly, urbane, buttoned up in blue serge, with his bowler hat and his boiled blue eye, stood Chief Inspector Masters. "Bit odd," the Chief Inspector remarked affably, "to see you taking a constitutional on a day like this. How are you, sir?" "Awful," said H.M. instantly, "but that's not the point. Masters, you crawling snake, you're the very man I wanted to see." Few things startled the Chief Inspector. This one did. "You," he repeated, "wanted to see me." "Uh-huh." And what about? Masters, do you remember the Victoria Adams case about 20 years ago? The Chief Inspector's manner suddenly changed and grew wary. Victoria Adams case, he ruminated. No, sir, I can't say I do. Son, you're lying. You were sergeant to old Chief Inspector Rutherford in those days, and well I remember it. Masters stood on his dignity. That is maybe, sir, but 20 years ago. A little girl of 12 or 13, the child of very wealthy parents, disappeared one night out of a country cottage with all the doors and windows locked on the inside. A week later, while everybody was having screaming hysterics, the child reappeared again, through the locks and bolts, tucked up in her bed as usual, and to this day nobody's ever known what really happened. There was a silence, while Masters shut his jaws hard. This family, the Adamses, persisted H.M., owned a cottage down Aylesbury way, on the edge of Goblin Wood, opposite the lake, or was it? Oh, growled Masters, it was. H.M. looked at him curiously. They used the cottage as a base for bathing in the summer and ice skating in the winter. It was black winter when the child vanished, and the place was all locked up against drafts. They say her old man nearly went loopy when he found her there a week later, lying asleep under the lamp, but all she'd say when they asked her where she'd been was, "I don't know." Again there was silence, while red buses thundered through the traffic press of Whitehall. You've got to admit, Masters, there was a flaming public rumpus. I say, did you ever read Barry's Mary Rose? No. Well, it was a situation straight out of Barry. Some people, you see, said that Vicky Adams was a child of faerie who'd been spirited away by the pixies. Whereupon Masters exploded. He removed his bowler hat and wiped his forehead. He made remarks about pixies in detail, which could not have been bettered by H.M. himself. "I know, son, I know." H.M. was soothing. Then his big voice sharpened. "Now tell me, was all this talk strictly true?" "What talk?" "Locked windows, bolted doors, no attic trap, no cellar, solid walls and floor." "Yes, sir," answered Masters, regaining his dignity with a powerful effort. "I'm bound to admit it was true." "Then there wasn't any jiggery-pokery about the cottage?" "In your eye there wasn't," said Masters. "How do you mean?" "Listen, sir," Masters lowered his voice. "Before the Adamses took over that place, it was a hideout for Chuck Randall. At that time he was the swellest of the swell mob. We lagged him a couple of years later. Do you think Chuck wouldn't have rigged up some gadget for a getaway? Just so, only, well, hey, we couldn't find it," grunted Masters. "And I'll bet that pleased old Chief Inspector Rutherford. I tell you straight, he was fair up the pole, especially as the kid herself was a pretty kid, all big eyes and dark hair. You couldn't help trusting her." "Yes," said H.M., "that's what worries me." "Worries you? Oh, my son," said H.M. dismally. "Here's Vicky Adams, a spoiled daughter of doting parents. She's supposed to be odd and fey. She's even encouraged to be. During her adolescence, the most impressionable time of her life, she gets wrapped round with the gauze of a mystery that people talk about even yet. What's that woman like now, Masters? What's that woman like now?" "Dear Sir Henry," murmured Miss Vicky Adams in her softest voice. She said this just as William Sage's car, with Bill and Eve Drayton in the front seat and Vicky and H.M. in the back seat, turned off the main road. Behind them lay the smoky red roofs of Aylesbury against the brightness of late afternoon. The car turned down a side road, a damp tunnel of greenery, and into another road which was little more than a lane between hedgerows. H.M., though cheered by 3 good-sized picnic hampers from Fortnum and Mason, their wickerwork lids bulging with a feast, did not seem happy. Nobody in the car was happy, with the possible exception of Miss Adams herself. Vicky, unlike Eve, was small and dark and vivacious. Her large light brown eyes, with very black lashes, could be arch and coy, or they could be dreamily intense. The late Sir James Barry might have called her a sprite. Those of more sober views would have recognised a different quality. She had an inordinate sex appeal, which was as palpable as a physical touch to any male within yards. And despite her smallness, Vicky had a full voice like Eve's. All these qualities she used even in so simple a matter as giving traffic directions. "First right," she would say, leaning forward to put her hands on Bill Sage's shoulders, "then straight on until the next traffic light. Ah, clever boy." Not at all," Bill would disclaim, with red ears and rather an erratic style of driving. "Oh, yes, you are," and Vicky would twist the lobe of his ear playfully before sitting back again. Eve Drayton didn't say anything. She didn't even turn round, yet the atmosphere, even of that quiet English picnic party, had already become a trifle hysterical. "Dear Sir Henry," murmured Vicky as they turned down into the deep lane between the hedgerows, "I do wish you wouldn't be so materialistic. I do, really. Haven't you the tiniest bit of spirituality in your nature?" "Me?" said H.M. in astonishment. "I got a very lofty spiritual nature, but what I want just now, my wench, is grub." "Oi!" Bill Sage glanced round. "By that speedometer," H.M. pointed, "we've now come 46 miles and a bit. We didn't even leave town until people of decency and sanity were having their tea. Where are we going?" "But didn't you know?" asked Vicky with wide-open eyes. "We're going to the cottage where I had such a dreadful experience when I was a child." "Was it such a dreadful experience, Vicky dear?" inquired Eve. Vicky's eyes seemed far away. "I don't remember, really. I was only a child, you see. I didn't understand. I hadn't developed the power for myself then." "What power?" H.M. asked sharply. "To dematerialise," said Vicky. "Of course." In that warm, sun-dusted lane, between the hawthorn hedges, the car jolted over a rut. Crockery rattled. "Aha, I see," observed H.M. without inflection. "And where do you go, my wench, when you dematerialise?" "Into a strange country. Through a little door. You wouldn't understand. Oh, you are such Philistines," moaned Vicky. Then, with a sudden change of mood, she leaned forward and her whole physical allurement flowed again towards Bill Sage. "You wouldn't like me to disappear, would you, Bill?" "Easy, easy." "Only," said Bill with a sort of wild gallantry, "if you promise to appear again, straight away." "Oh, I should have to do that." Vicky sat back. She was trembling. "The power wouldn't be strong enough. But even a poor little thing like me might be able to teach you a lesson. Look there." And she pointed ahead. On their left, as the lane widened, stretched the 10-acre gloom of what is fancifully known as Goblin Wood. On their right lay a small lake on private property, and therefore deserted. The cottage, set well back into a clearing of the wood so as to face the road, screened from it by a line of beeches, was in fact a bungalow of rough-hewn stone with a slate roof. Across the front of it ran a wooden porch. It had a seedy air, like the long yellow-green grass of its front lawn. Bill parked the car at the side of the road, since there was no driveway. "It's a bit lonely, ain't it?" demanded H.M. His voice boomed out against the utter stillness under the hot sun. "Oh, yes," breathed Vicky. She jumped out of the car in a whirl of skirts. "That's why they were able to come and take me when I was a child." "They?" "Dear Sir Henry, do I need to explain?" Then Vicky looked at Bill. "I must apologise," she said, "for the state the house is in. I haven't been out here for months and months. There's a modern bathroom, I'm glad to say. Only paraffin lamps, of course. But then," a dreamy smile flashed across her face, "you won't need lamps, will you? Unless—" "You mean," said Bill, who was taking a black case out of the car, "unless you disappear again?" "Yes, Bill, and promise me you won't be frightened when I do." The young man uttered a ringing oath, which was shushed by Sir Henry Merrivale, who austerely said he disapproved of profanity. Eve Drayton was very quiet. "But in the meantime," Vicky said wistfully, "let's forget it all, shall we?" Let's laugh and dance and sing and pretend we're children, and surely our guest must be even more hungry by this time. It was in this emotional state that they sat down to their picnic. H.M., if the truth must be told, did not fare too badly. Instead of sitting on some hummock of ground, they dragged a table and chairs to the shaded porch. All spoke in strained voices, but no word of controversy was said. It was only afterwards, when the cloth was cleared, the furniture and hampers pushed indoors, the empty bottles flung away, that danger tapped a warning. From under the porch, Vicky fished out 2 half-rotted deck chairs, which she sat up in the long grass of the lawn. These were to be occupied by Eve and H.M., while Vicky took Bill Sage to inspect a plum tree of some remarkable quality she did not specify. Eve sat down without comment. H.M., who was smoking a black cigar opposite her, waited some time before he spoke. "You know," he said, taking the cigar out of his mouth, "you're behaving remarkably well." "Yes," Eve laughed, "aren't I? Are you pretty well acquainted with this Adams gal?" "I'm her first cousin," Eve answered simply. "Now that her parents are dead, I'm the only relative she's got. I know all about her." From far across the lawn floated 2 voices saying something about wild strawberries. Eve, her fair hair and fair complexion vivid against the dark line of Goblin Wood, clenched her hands on her knees. "You see, H.M., she hesitated, "there was another reason why I invited you here. I don't quite know how to approach it." "I'm the old man," said H.M., tapping himself impressively on the chest. "You tell me." "Eve, darling," interposed Vicky's voice, crying across the ragged lawn. "Cooey! Eve!" "Yes, dear?" "I've just remembered," cried Vicky, "that I haven't shown Bill over the cottage. You don't mind if I steal him away from you for a little while?" "No, dear, of course not." It was H.M., sitting so as to face the bungalow, who saw Vicky and Bill go in. He saw Vicky's wistful smile as she closed the door after them. Eve did not even look round. The sun was declining, making fiery chinks through the thickness of Goblin Wood behind the cottage. "I won't let her have him," Eve suddenly cried. I won't. "Does she want him, my wench? Or, which is more to the point, does he want her?" "He never has," Eve said with emphasis. "Not really, and he never will." H.M., motionless, puffed out cigar smoke. "Vicky's a faker," said Eve. "Does that sound catty?" "Not necessarily. I was just thinking the same thing myself." "I'm patient," said Eve. Her blue eyes were fixed. "I'm terribly, terribly patient. I can wait years for what I want. Bill's not making much money now, and I haven't got a bean. But Bill's got great talent under that easy-going manner of his. He must have the right girl to help him. If only the elfin sprite would leave him alone, hey?" "Vicky acts like that," said Eve, "toward practically every man she ever meets. That's why she never married. She says it leaves her soul free to commune with other souls, this occultism." Then it all poured out, the family story of the Adamses. This repressed girl spoke at length, spoke as perhaps she had never spoken before. Vicky Adams, the child who wanted to attract attention, her father, Uncle Fred, and her mother, Aunt Margaret, seemed to walk in vividness as the shadows gathered. I was too young to know her at the time of the disappearance, of course, but I knew her afterwards, and I thought, "Well, if I could get you here," said Eve. "I thought she'd try to show off with some game, and then you'd expose her, and Bill would see what an awful faker she is. But it's hopeless. It's hopeless." "Looky here," observed H.M., who was smoking his 3rd cigar. He sat up. "Doesn't it strike you those 2 were being a rummy awful long time just in looking through a little bungalow?" Eve, roused out of a dream, stared back at him. She sprang to her feet. She was not now, you could guess, thinking of any disappearance. "Excuse me a moment," she said curtly. Eve hurried across to the cottage, went up on the porch and opened the front door. H.M. heard her heels rap down the length of the small passage inside. She marched straight back again, closed the front door and rejoined H.M. All the doors of the rooms are shut, she announced in a high voice. I really don't think I ought to disturb them. Easy, my wench. I have absolutely no interest, declared Eve, with the tears coming into her eyes, in what happens to either of them now. Shall we take the car and go back to town without them? H.M. threw away his cigar, got up and seized her by the shoulders. I'm the old man, he said with a leer like an ogre. Will you listen to me? No. If I'm any reader of the human dial, persisted H.M., that young fella's no more gone on Vicky Adams than I am. He was scared, my wench. Scared. Doubt, indecision crossed H.M.'s face. I dunno what he's scared of, burn me I don't, but... Hoy! Called the voice of Bill Sage. It did not come from the direction of the cottage. They were surrounded on 3 sides by Goblin Wood, now blurred with twilight. From the north side, the voice bawled at them, followed by crackling and dry undergrowth. Bill, his hair and sports coat and flannels more than a little dirty, regarded them with a face of bitterness. Here are her blasted wild strawberries, he announced, extending his hand. 3 of 'em. The fruitful, result of 3/4 of an hour hard labour. I absolutely refuse to chase 'em in the dark. For a moment, Eve Drayton's mouth moved without speech. Then you weren't in the cottage all this time? In the cottage? Bill glanced at it. I was in that cottage, he said, about 5 minutes. Vicky had a woman's whim. She wanted some wild strawberries out of what she called the forest. Wait a minute, son, said H.M. very sharply. You didn't come out that front door? Nobody did. No, I went out the back door. It opened straight on the wood. Yes, and what happened then? Well, I went to look for these damned... No, what did she do? Vicky. She locked and bolted the back door on the inside. I remember her grinning at me through the glass panel. She... Bill stopped short. His eyes widened and then narrowed, as though at the impact of an idea. All 3 of them turned to look at the rough stone cottage. By the way, said Bill. He cleared his throat vigorously. By the way, have you seen Vicky since then? No. This couldn't be... It could be, son, said H.M. We'd all better go in there and have a look. They hesitated for a moment on the porch. A warm, moist fragrance breathed up from the ground after sunset. In half an hour it would be completely dark. Bill Sage threw open the front door and shouted Vicky's name. That sound seemed to penetrate, reverberating, through every room. The intense heat and stuffiness of the cottage, where no window had been raised in months, blew out at them. But nobody answered. Get inside, snapped H.M., and stop yowling. The old maestro was nervous. I'm dead sure she didn't get out by the front door, but we'll just make certain there's no slipping out now. Stumbling over the table and chairs they had used on the porch, he fastened the front door. They were in a narrow passage, once handsome with parquet floor and pine-panelled walls, leading to a door with a glass panel at the rear. H.M. lumbered forward to inspect this door and found it locked and bolted, as Bill had said. Goblin Wood drew darker. Keeping well together, they searched the cottage. It was not large, having 2 good-sized rooms on one side of the passage and 2 small rooms on the other side, so as to make space for bathroom and kitchenette. H.M., raising fogs of dust, ransacked every inch where a person could possibly hide. And all the windows were locked on the inside, and the chimney flues were too narrow to admit anybody. And Vicky Adams wasn't there. Oh, my eye! Breathed Sir Henry Merrivale. They had gathered, by what idiotic impulse not even H.M. could have said, just outside the open door of the bathroom. A bath tap dripped monotonously. The last light through a frosted glass window showed 3 faces hung there, as though disembodied. Bill, said Eve in an unsteady voice, this is a trick. Oh, I've longed for her to be exposed. This is a trick. Then where is she? H.M. can tell us, can't you, H.M.? Well, now, muttered the great man. Across H.M.'s Panama hat was a large black handprint, made there when he had pressed down the hat after investigating the chimney. He glowered under it. Son, he said to Bill, there's just one question I want you to answer in all this hokey-pokey. When you went out picking wild strawberries, will you swear Vicky Adams didn't go with you?" "As God is my judge, she didn't," returned Bill, with fervency and obvious truth. "Besides, how the devil could she? Look at the lock and bolt on the back door." H.M. made 2 more violent black handprints on his hat. He lumbered forward, his head down, 2 or 3 paces in the narrow passage. His foot half skidded on something that had been lying there unnoticed, and he picked it up. It was a large square section of thin waterproof oilskin, jagged at one corner. "Have you found anything?" demanded Bill in a strained voice. "No, not to make any sense, that is. But just a minute." At the rear of the passage, on the left-hand side, was the bedroom from which Vicky Adams had vanished as a child. Though H.M. had searched this room once before, he opened the door again. It was now almost dark in Goblin Wood. He saw dimly a room 20 years before, a room of flounces, of lace curtains, of once polished mahogany, its mirrors glimmering against white-papered walls. H.M. seemed especially interested in the windows. He ran his hands carefully round the frame of each, even climbing laboriously up on a chair to examine the tops. He borrowed a box of matches from Bill, and the little spurts of light, following the rasp of the match, rasped against his nerves as well. The hope died out of his face, and his companion saw it. "H.M., Bill said for the 1000th time, "where is she?" "Son," replied H.M. despondently, "I don't know." "Let's get out of here," Eve said abruptly. Her voice was a small scream. I know it's all a trick. I know Vicky's a faker, but let's get out of here. For God's sake, let's get out of here." "As a matter of fact," Bill cleared his throat, "I agree. Anyway, we won't hear from Vicky until tomorrow morning." "Oh, yes, you will," whispered Vicky's voice out of the darkness. Eve screamed. They lighted a lamp, but there was nobody there. Their retreat from the cottage, it must be admitted, was not very dignified. How they stumbled down that ragged lawn in the dark, how they piled rugs and picnic hampers into the car, how they eventually found the main road again, is best left undescribed. Sir Henry Merrivale has since sneered at this. "A bit of a goosey feeling. Nothing much." And it is true that he has no nerves to speak of. But he can be worried, badly worried, and that he was worried on this occasion may be deduced from what happened next. H.M., after dropping in at Claridge's for a modest late supper of lobster and pêche melba, returned to his house in Brook Street and slept a hideous sleep. It was 3 o'clock in the morning, even before the summer dawn, when the ringing of the bedside telephone roused him. What he heard sent his blood pressure soaring. "Dear Sir Henry," crooned a familiar and sprite-like voice. H.M. was himself again, full of gall and bile. He switched on the bedside lamp and put on his spectacles with care so as adequately to address the phone. "Have I got the honour," he said with dangerous politeness, "of addressing Miss Vicky Adams?" "Oh, yes." "I sincerely trust," said H.M., "you've been having a good time. Are you materialised yet?" "Oh, yes." "Where are you now?" "I'm afraid," there was coy laughter in the voice, "that must be a little secret for a day or two. I want to teach you a really good lesson. Blessings, dear." And she hung up the receiver. H.M. didn't say anything. He climbed out of bed, he stalked up and down the room, his corporation majestic under an old-fashioned nightshirt stretching to his heels. Then, since he himself had been waked up at 3 o'clock in the morning, the obvious course was to wake up somebody else. So he dialed the home number of Chief Inspector Masters. "No, sir," retorted Masters grimly, after coughing the frog out of his throat. I do not mind you ringing me up, not a bit of it." He spoke with a certain pleasure. "Because I've got a bit of news for you." H.M. eyed the phone suspiciously. "Masters, are you trying to do me in the eye again?" "It's what you're always trying to do to me, isn't it?" All right, growled H.M. "What's the news?" "Do you remember mentioning the Vicky Adams case to me yesterday?" Sort of, yes. Well, I had a word or two round among our people. I was tipped the wink to go and see a certain solicitor. He was old Mr. Fred Adams's solicitor before Mr. Adams died about 6 or 7 years ago. Here Master's voice grew suave with triumph. I always said, Sir Henry, that Chuck Randall had planted some gadget in that cottage for a quick getaway. And I was right. The gadget was— You were quite right, Masters. The gadget was a trick window. The telephone, so to speak, gave a start. What's that? A trick window, H.M. spoke patiently. You press a spring, and the whole frame of the window, 2 leaves locked together, slides down between the walls far enough so you can climb over. Then you push it back up again. How in lum's name do you know that? Oh, my son. They used to build windows like it in country houses during the persecution of Catholic priests. It was a good enough second guess, only it won't work. Masters seemed annoyed. It won't work now, Masters agreed. And do you know why? I can guess. Tell me. Because just before Mr. Adams died, he discovered how his darling daughter had flummoxed him. He never told anybody except his lawyer. He took a handful of 4-inch nails and sealed up the top of that frame so tight an orangutan couldn't move it, and painted them over so they wouldn't be noticed. You can notice them now. I doubt if the young lady herself ever knew, but by George, Masters said savagely, I'd like to see anybody try the same game now. You would, hey? Then it will interest you to know that the same gal has just disappeared out of the same house again. H.M. began a long narrative of the facts, but he had to break off because the telephone was raving. Honest, Masters, H.M. said seriously, I'm not joking. She didn't get through the window, but she did get out. You'd better meet me, he gave directions, tomorrow morning. In the meantime, son, sleep well. It was, therefore, a worn-faced Masters who went into the visitors' room at the Senior Conservatives Club just before lunch on the following day. The visitors' room is a dark sepulchral place, opening on an airwell, where the visitor is surrounded by pictures of dyspeptic-looking gentlemen with beards. It has a pervading mustiness of wood and leather. Though whiskey and soda stood on the table, H.M. sat in a leather chair, far away from it, ruffling his hands across his bald head. Now, Masters, keep your shirt on, he warned. This business may be rummy, but it's not a police matter, yet. I know it's not a police matter, Masters said grimly. All the same, I've had a word with the superintendent at Aylesbury. Fowler? You know him? Sure, I know everybody. Is he going to keep an eye out? He's going to have a look at that ruddy cottage. I've asked for any telephone calls to be put through here. In the meantime, sir, it was at this point, as though diabolically inspired, that the telephone rang. H.M. reached it before Masters. It's the old man, he said, unconsciously assuming a stance of grandeur. Yes, Masters is here, but he's drunk. You tell me first. What's that? The telephone talked thinly. Sure, I looked in the kitchen cupboard, bellowed H.M., though I didn't honestly expect to find Vicky Adams hiding there. What's that? Say it again. Plates? Cups it had been? An almost frightening change had come over H.M.'s expression. He stood motionless. All the posturing went out of him. He was not even listening to the voice that still talked thinly, while his eyes and his brain moved to put together facts. At length, though the voice still talked, he hung up the receiver. H.M. blundered back to the centre table, where he drew out a chair and sat down. Masters, he said very quietly, I've come close to making the silliest mistake of my life. Here he cleared his throat. I shouldn't have made it, son. I really shouldn't. But don't yell at me for cutting off Fowler. I can tell you now how Vicky Adams disappeared. And she said one true thing when she said she was going into a strange country. How do you mean? She's dead, answered H.M. The word fell with a heavy weight into that dingy room where the bearded faces looked down. You see, H.M. went on blankly, a lot of us were right when we thought Vicky Adams was a faker. She was. To attract attention to herself, she played that trick on her family with the hocussed window. She's lived and traded on it ever since. That's what sent me straight in the wrong direction. I was on the alert for some trick Vicky Adams might play, so it never occurred to me that this elegant pair of beauties, Miss Eve Drayton and Mr. William Sage, were deliberately conspiring to murder her. Masters got slowly to his feet. Did you say murder? Oh, yes. Again, H.M. cleared his throat. It was all arranged beforehand for me to be a witness. They knew Vicky Adams couldn't resist a challenge to disappear, especially as Vicky always believed she could get out by the trick window. They wanted Vicky to say she was going to disappear. They never knew anything about the trick window, Masters, but they knew their own plan very well. Eve Drayton even told me the motive. She hated Vicky, of course. That wasn't the main point. She was Vicky Adams's only relative. She'd inherit an awful big scoopful of money. Eve said she could be patient, and burn me how her eyes meant it when she said that. Rather than risk any slightest suspicion of murder, she was willing to wait 7 years until a disappeared person can be presumed dead. Our Eve, I think, was the fiery driving force of that conspiracy. She was only scared part of the time. Sage was scared all of the time. But it was Sage who did the real dirty work. He lured Vicky Adams into that cottage, while Eve kept me in close conversation on the lawn. H.M. paused. Intolerably vivid in the mind of Chief Inspector Masters, who had seen it years before, rose the picture of the rough stone bungalow against the darkening wood. "Masters," said H.M., "why should a bath tap be dripping in a house that hadn't been occupied for months?" "Well, Sage, you see, is a surgeon. I saw him take his black case of instruments out of the car. He took Vicky Adams into that house. In the bathroom, he stabbed her, he stripped her, and he dismembered her body in the bathtub. Easy, son." "Go on," said Masters without moving. The head, the torso, the folded arms and legs were wrapped up in 3 large square pieces of thin, transparent oilskin. Each was sewed up with coarse thread so the blood wouldn't drip. Last night I found one of the oilskin pieces he'd ruined when his needle slipped at the corner. Then he walked out of the house, with the back door still standing unlocked, to get his wild strawberry alibi. "Sage went out of there," shouted Masters, "leaving the body in the house." "Oh, yes," agreed H.M. "But where did he leave it?" H.M. ignored this. "In the meantime, son, what about Eve Drayton? At the end of the arranged 3/4 of an hour, she indicated there was hanky-panky between her fiancé and Vicky Adams. She flew into the house, but what did she do? She walked to the back of the passage. I heard her. There she simply locked and bolted the back door, and then she marched out to join me with tears in her eyes, and these 2 beauties were ready for investigation." "Investigation," said Masters, "with that body still in the house?" "Oh, yes." Masters lifted both fists. "It must have given young Sage a shock," said H.M., "when I found that piece of waterproof oilskin he'd washed, but dropped. Anyway, these 2 had only 2 more bits of hokey-pokey. The vanished gal had to speak to show she was still alive. If you'd been there, son, you'd have noticed that Eve Drayton's got a voice just like Vicky Adams's. If someone speaks in a dark room, carefully imitating the coy tone she never uses herself, the illusion's going to be pretty good. The same goes for a telephone." "It was finished, Masters. All that had to be done was to remove the body from the house and to get it far away from there." "But that's just what I'm asking you, sir. Where was the body all this time? And who in the blazes did remove the body from the house?" "All of us did," answered H.M. "What's that?" "Masters," said H.M., "aren't you forgetting the picnic hampers?" And now the Chief Inspector saw H.M. was white as a ghost. His next words took Masters like a blow between the eyes. 3 good-sized wickerwork hampers with lids. After our big meal on the porch, those hampers were shoved inside the house where Sage could get at 'em. He had to leave most of the used crockery behind, in the kitchen cupboard, but 3 wickerwork hampers from a picnic and 3 butcher's parcels to go inside 'em. I carried one down to the car myself. It felt a bit funny. H.M. stretched out his hand, not too steadily, towards the whiskey. You know, he said, I'll always wonder whether I was carrying the head. So that was The House in Goblin Wood by Carter Dickson, who was actually John Dickson Carr. Not John Dickinson Carr, John Dickson Carr. So thank you, first of all, as I said at the very beginning, to Gavin Critchley. Gavin, every quarter, allows me a stipend from and is my sponsor, really, and sponsors an episode. So if you could thank Gavin and you comment in the comments, I'm sure he'd be delighted to see that. So let's say something about the story. This is the part of the podcast where I say something about the author, then about the story. I may digress. I'll try not to digress too much, to keep a tight rein on my brain. So Carter Dickson, a.k.a. John Dickson Carr, born November 30th, 1906, died February 27th, 1977, was an American author of detective stories who wrote under the pseudonyms Carter Dickson, as with this one, and Roger Fairbairn. He was a prominent writer of detective fiction. He was born in Uniontown, Pennsylvania, and later moved to England, where he spent most of his life. This story is clearly written in England, written about an English scene, very English. The guy has intimate knowledge of English society to portray the characters as he does. He wrote 70 novels and numerous short stories, and he is, and this is salient, he is considered one of the masters of the locked room mystery genre, and his works continue to be popular. Yeah, perhaps not as popular as they deserve. So The House in Goblin Wood is a classic locked room mystery. I should say something. I was doing this. I first came across this story in a Weird Tales anthology, and I loved it. At that time, I was reading a lot more ghost stories and detective stories and wasn't as familiar with the detective genre as I am becoming. So I thought originally that it's got a great spooky title, hasn't it? The House in Goblin Wood by Carter Dickson. Yeah, we know all that. And I started it off in the template I use for classic ghost stories, and then I realised, do you know what? This is a classic detective stories. It does blur as many. There's a whole raft of supernatural detectives, and there was a blending of the genres of the ghost story and the detective story in the late Victorian, Edwardian, and pre-war period, particularly, and Kanaki the Ghost Hunter, etc. And they treated it. Wilkie Collins' A Woman in White, for example, could be a ghost story, but it isn't. The Open Door by Margaret Oliphant, that's a different one. There are 2 stories called The Open Door by Charlotte Riddell, which I've done. I haven't done the Margaret Oliphant one. I've read it, obviously, but I've never done it. I will do one of these days, inshallah, as they say. Yeah, so and they vary how supernatural and how detective they are. Some are, and the case of the Sussex Vampire, of course, the Sherlock Holmes story, which I've done, of course. It could be supernatural, but in many cases in the late Victorian period, that kind of triumph of rationalism, they turn out to be Scooby-Doo stories, really, as I said. This is later, of course. This was published in 1947, so it's much later in the Strand magazine, very prestigious, in November 47, but appeared in Ellery Queen's Mystery magazine in the same month and year. So this story introduces Sir Henry Merrivale. Now, the other thing I've got to say about his language, Callie's just come up to see me, I hope she didn't make a noise, is the dropping the G at the end, which was a mark of upper-class speech, old-fashioned upper-class speech. And when I talked about this before, I mentioned Simon Roper. Now, if you like the history of English and how it's pronounced and its development over the centuries. Simon Roper is the go-to guy. He's got a fantastic channel on YouTube, and he actually did a recent one. Not that recent now, but when I listened to it, and it was like the accent going back from the 1970s, the 1950s, the 1930s, 20s. Hang on. And he's got record. I keep getting interrupted by my Finnish music. Again, some kind of clue there. But so Simon Roper actually pronounces them, and the upper class English in the 19th century, I think. I can't remember exactly, but sort of this guy is an old man in these terms. So it's probably written in about it's written in the 40s, but it's set in something like the 20s or 30s. So he would be born maybe in the 1870s or so, let's say. So the upper class thing was to drop the G. And of course, Dorothy L. Sayers does this with Peter Wimsey. To my amusement, when I did one of the stories and drop the G's as I've done here. So going, thinking, hunting, shooting, fishing, people complained about my diction. But they were wrong. They were such fools. They must have been so embarrassed at themselves later. So where were we with that? Henry Merrivale. So it is about, as we know, the disappearance of Vicky Adams. I want to say something about how good this story is and how well Carter does it. So first of all, we are fed our prejudices and we eat them only for him to show us. I'm struggling with this metaphor without becoming quite disgusting. Show us that we're gonna throw them up, aren't we? Yeah, that's where I was going with it. So basically, we're introduced to Eve, who's such a lovely girl. You knew my father, nice, and she's beautiful in English and young. And beauty and goodness, remember, we struggle to separate beauty and goodness. The Greeks thought they were the same thing. We kind of know they're not the same thing. The beautiful are not necessarily the good, and vice versa. But we struggle. We struggle with it. There's a kind of an instinctive thing to trust beautiful people more. I think there are psychological studies showing this. And so we're fed this ever so nice girl, and she's very polite, and she's not over the top. She doesn't make an exhibition of herself. She has all those English virtues of modesty, reticence, and we may not do it very often, but we aspire to it. The stiff upper lip. We don't like to make a show, that's her, isn't it? And we see this ever so nice young chap who's a surgeon, for goodness sake. So these are very respectable, and we are sold these lovely. We that's what we're sold, and we believe them, we trust them, and even though he foreshadows it right down the line. So they're sitting outside the Senior Conservatives Club, and he says, "Do you think this is going to work?" Now, at that point, this is like ellipsis. This is a technique called ellipsis. So you mention something, he walked into the room, like who? So we introduce a pronoun or something that stands in. So is this going to work? And then we don't actually identify that pronoun. So, he can refer to Tony Walker. So he walked into the room. Who does that refer to? Tony Walker. We're later told. So is this going to work? And our brains are searching for, what does this link up to? It creates this Zygarnik tension, as it's known, after a Bulgarian psychologist. And then it becomes clear it's to invite him to a picnic. Is this going to work? That's what it is. That isn't what it is. That's how he misdirects us. We think it's about the first thing we think is about the picnic. And he misdirects us all down the line. And so the first thing... And the other prejudice he subverts is we have Vicky, who's a bit of a flibbity-gibbet, isn't she? She's a sort of, she's a husky voice. She's some kind of, you can imagine the kind of girl. And she leans over and fiddles with his ear and, "Oh, you'd like me to," and she's very flirtatious. So, and she's also into the occult, and she's fey. And we see this, and he feeds us this stereotype of this rather theatrical, not empty-headed, but theatrical. So it's not that she's thick. It's that she's deliberately, and I think Eve says this, drawing attention to us. She's the sort of girl who loves to draw attention to herself. Now, our prejudice is we don't like people like that. So there we are. So this helps, these feeding us our prejudice helps him get us to swallow the hook. So as we go on, he misdirects us, as I said, time and time again. So the first thing is, what is this all about? It's about inviting Sir Henry Melville to Henry Merrivale, to a picnic, and he doesn't like going to picnics because he's a stuffy old conservative. Well, and she does this, and how are you going to get him to come to the picnic? Well, we're going to play on his sense of professional failure. They failed. As he bumps into the detective who failed. They both failed, and they have this professional failure, so they want to put it right. And also this he introduces this locked room mystery. This young girl disappeared. She then said, being the flibbity-gibbet, fey, airheaded thing, this bimbo, if we may say, that she is, I lived with the faeries, and that clearly probably isn't true. Most of us don't believe that. On another podcast, I may be saying something different, but in this case, so that's the first mystery we're going to count, and then Eve's motivation for inviting him is the first thing is to solve the mystery. That's what we think it's about at first. Second one, it becomes clear to us it's about debunking this airhead, this silly girl who's got airs and graces, and she just needs to be brought down a peg or two. That's the second. The third is, it turns out we introduce this element of jealousy. It turns out that she's not plain, but she's plain in nature, not in appearance, whereas Vicky's very sultry, isn't she? And she's jealous, and that's the next one. And we buy these. He sells us these one after the other, getting him to go to the picnic, to bring this vapid girl down a peg or two. Oh, but then the truth is, it's not about that at all. It's about her jealousy, and we congratulate ourselves as readers for having uncovered the true motivation. Oh, yes, that's what it's really about. We feel kind of self-satisfied. I certainly did at that point. And then he foreshadows the real reason as well. He says, there's I wrote this down, it's something like, he says, are you pretty well acquainted with this Adams gal? I'm her first cousin, Eve answered, simply, now that her parents are dead. I'm the only relative she's got. That's the big clue. That is the big clue. She's the only relative. It's actually reinforced, because a bit later she says Vicky acts like that towards practically every man she ever meets. That's why she never married, i.e. she's got no husband, therefore I am the heir. Yeah, he's told us exactly what the real motive is, but he buried it so we didn't see it, because in that I'm a first cousin now that her parents are dead. I know all about her. And that immediately shifts us back to this, oh yes, this elfin sprite thing. She wants to take her down a peg or two because she's so puffed up and flirtatious. So she tells us the real reason. It's about money, about the heir. And then he kind of, in the second sentence, I know all about her. He drags our attention back to his previous focus, which was, I want to take her down a peg or two. I'm jealous of her, and he misdirects us fantastically. So he talks about her as the elfin sprite, and she says it leaves her soul free to commune with other souls, this occultism. So occultism, it was a bigger deal than it is now, late Victorian period, early 20th century. You have people like Crowley, of course, Gerald Gardner and Wicca. And then coming on to the 70s later than this, of course, we have Alexander's and those pictures, what do you call them? There's a word for it. I've forgotten what it is at the moment. Pictures of Maxine Sanders, who's a rather attractive blonde woman, naked, and salubrious. Yes, no, not salubrious. The other side of it. There has been this vein of, we know what these people are like. They're alternatives. They're wacky. They're weirdies. My stepfather always used to use that word, and I noticed my brother uses it as well. Not weirdos, but weirdies. I quite like it. That's who they are. So it's about subverting our expectations, misdirecting us with our own prejudices and our own curiosity, and telling us the truth without telling us the truth. Almost, do you know what I mean? He's like, he tells us what the story is, what the real reason is, but he doesn't point it up enough. And it's not about you being clever in detective stories. It's about sleight of hand. It's about like a stage magician shows you this happening while they're doing something behind your back. They drag your attention to what they want you to see. It's not about you being stupid. It's about the manipulation of attention. In this case, not through hand gestures, but through writing. And your man, John Dickson Carr, is a master of this. In fact, I would normally say master, but for some reason I was still in storytelling mode. Yeah, so let's say something else about it's also a classic locked room mystery. So a locked room mystery is a subgenre of detective fiction in which a crime, almost always a murder. The second case, it was a murder. In the first case, it was a disappearance, is committed under seemingly impossible circumstances. The crime scene is typically a closed environment like a locked room from which no one can escape, yet a crime occurs. So you can see how this fits. It fits it perfectly. The setting is a cottage with 4 rooms, all of which have been thoroughly searched. All windows are locked from the inside and the chimney flues are too narrow for anyone to pass through. Remember, he gets the soot on him, presenting an ostensibly inescapable environment. The foreshadowing, though not complete, lies with the revelation that the cottage was once the hideout for a criminal. Because remember, if you don't foreshadow, you upset your readers because they go, "Oh, how was I supposed to know that?" You know. And so the proper detective story writer drops the foreshadowing in. Chuck Randall used to live there. So when we get the revelation in the end, we're not surprised. We go, of course, you know, rather than, oh, come on. So there was a secret window, but it was nailed up. The trick window was nailed up because her dad apparently knew about it and he nailed it up so it couldn't be worked anymore. And of course, usually this isn't the locked. I mean, well, let's say something more about it. So the first full novel of the locked room mystery was The Woman in White, Wilkie Collins, 1860, but the concept gained significant popularity with Edgar Allan Poe's The Murders in the Rue Morgue. And if you haven't heard my version of that, I was nearly said who did it, but please go and listen to it if you don't know it. And that's considered the first proper locked room mystery. That was 1841, so in fact it's 20 years. My notes are the wrong way around. It's 20 years before, 19 years before Collins' Woman in White. So the classic is John Dickson Carr. He's the classic of this, the master of the locked room mystery. The Hollow Man, known as The Three Coffins, was regarded by a panel of 70 mystery authors as the best locked room mystery of all time. This isn't too technical, really, is it? It's a window. There you go. It's a nailed up trick window. And then we have Gaston Leroux. He did a story called The Mystery of the Yellow Room, Locked Room. Go and read that. I haven't done that one yet. And I've done the Phantom of the Opera, though, so please go and listen to that. That's very long. That's about 8 hours. So 8 hours of me talking to you, can you imagine? And Sheila would shoot herself if she had to put up with that. So she hasn't got a gun, just don't worry. And then Agatha Christie, of course, dabbled with it. She didn't just do the locked rooms, but and then there were none, and Murder on Orient Express can be considered. Bizarrely, unexpectedly, Isaac Asimov did a story called The Acquisitive Chuckle, which was about the character Black Widowers. So yeah, those are classic. And also there's a Chinese Orange Mystery by Ellery Queen. So it is just in summary then, it's a really, really good story. It's fantastically written, and I don't think you realise how well written it is until you look at his technique and what he's done. You know, all the things we've mentioned, which I was about to mention again, and I thought, no, that's rather redundant. Although it's never stopped me before, has it? But so a great story, and kind of Scooby-Doo-ish, really. The house in Goblin Wood, I was all set up, and I'd read it before, I was all set up for a supernatural thing, and that's part of it, of course. He sets up this occult atmosphere. So he does definitely introduce this supernatural, almost like a watercolour wash, if you like, over the whole thing. Goblin Wood, she lived with the pixies. You know, it's as if, but he makes fun of it, really. He's making fun of it. There we are. See you next week.